All right. Hey, everyone. How's it going? Jeremy Langwall here, coming to you from Homus House Estate and Gardens, and so glad to be back in the kitchen doing some cooking with you guys. Before we get started with our dish, just a couple of housekeeping things. First things first, I have to thank my buddy Jesse and the owner of Homus House, Kevin Kelly, Mr. Kevin, who's out there watching as well, for filling in for me last week. Something came up last minute where, unfortunately, I was unable to attend, so sorry about that, but it's so great to know that you have a team behind you that always has your back. So Jesse jumped in, Mr. Kevin jumped in, they prepared chicken marsala. Even though they did the recipe completely backwards, it still worked. So again, Jesse, behind the camera, just to show you, you can always modify the recipes. There's always different ways that we can attack this, and hey, they proved it live. Thanks so much for them. As we get started, always know that we're live. So if at any point during any of the cooking demos you have any questions, now that you've gotten to meet Jessie, she's behind the camera, looking at the comments. You have a question, don't hesitate to let us know. Also, one personal thing before we get started cooking, I wanted to give a shout out. Unfortunately, in our chef community 2 days ago, we lost an absolute legend. His name was Chef Reggie Watkins, and he was a personal friend of mine. I got to work side by side with him for a year, and he was just an absolute legend of a chef. He was the first hire by the famed chef Charlie Trotter, who, if there was a Mount Rushmore of the great American chefs that lived, you'd have someone like a Thomas Keller, and without a doubt, Chef Charlie Trotter would be on that Mount Rushmore of great American chefs. And Reggie Watkins was Chef Charlie Trotter's first hire when he opened his famed restaurant in Chicago in 1984. And he got to travel the world with Chef Trotter. And someone like me, fun fact about me is, as I started my culinary journey in the 90s, my first cookbook, my favorite cookbook, is the Charlie Trotter cookbook. And Charlie Trotter was the chef that was a bucket list chef for me. I had to go to his restaurant. His cookbook is my favorite personal cookbook of all time. And it was such an honor for me to be able to work side by side with someone who had contact with him like Reggie did. And we would speak for hours about just chef life, and I would pick his brain about working with Chef Trotter, and it was just an absolute honor to be able to get to know Reggie and work with Reggie. So Reggie, my brother, I love you, and I dedicate this little humble recipe to you. All right, let's go ahead and get started. So the dish we're preparing today is Catfish Provencal. Let's talk a little bit about it as we get started. First of all, in Louisiana, we love catfish. However, if you are here, unfortunately, I think us as cooks and chefs of this area can do a little bit more with catfish. 9 times out of 10, when you see a catfish, if you're eating catfish in Louisiana, it's almost always going to be fried, which is great, or it might be baked, and that's going to be most of the time. You almost never see any recipes that really go beyond that. Of course, there's some that exist, but that's just not common, and I personally want to change that. I think we could take a fish like catfish and really give it just as much thought and preparation as any great fish out there. And of course, if you're not have access to catfish, this recipe can very simply be changed. Why? You could use sea bass, you could use speckled trout, you could use salmon. Any fish can work with this recipe, but we wanted to take this humble fish, catfish, and really kind of elevate it. So what I wanted to do was still keep it kind of, give it that Creole classic flavor. So we're doing it Provencal. We're going to go ahead and get started, and I'll talk more about what that means when we talk about cooking in Provencal. But the first thing I'm going to do is I have a pan that I'm getting hot. I have my catfish fillets over here, and I'm just going to very simply season them with a little bit of salt and cracked black pepper. That's it. Now, I'm seasoning both sides. Now, for all my friends at home, if you ever, oddly enough, this is a question I get sometimes. People ask you, do you season both sides? Well, my answer is always, if you're going to eat both sides, season both sides. So we're going to eat both sides. It would be weird just to eat one side, so we're going to season both sides. All I'm doing is I'm dipping this fish into just some egg wash, a couple cracked eggs, and a splash of milk or water, and I'm going right into flour. Now, because we seasoned the fish very well, you don't have to season the flour. You can go one of two ways. Season the flour, lightly season the fish, or else we season the fish well. So the flour, we're not going to season because we really wanted you to have just a light coating. So I dip it quickly in that egg wash, the fillets. I'm going to then just mix it around a little bit of this flour, And I'm going to shake off all excess because I do want a light, I don't want too heavy of a batter. And I'm going to go right into a skillet, nice hot skillet. As always, we want to hear exactly what we got there. We want to hear that sizzle. Having a hot pan and putting your fish or whatever you're cooking, sauteing or searing, it's always critical that you have your skillet turned on high or medium high to where you get that sizzle. If I were to throw this fish into the pan and I didn't have that sizzle, well, now we're going to run into some problems. I'm using a Teflon pan, which helps, but if the pan's cold, you don't get that sizzle, well, that batter and flour that we just put in here, it's going to absorb that oil that we put into the pan, and then it's going to start to stick and bake on to the bottom of the skillet, and we don't want that. Whereas whenever we throw that fish right into a hot skillet, it instantly starts to toast that flour on the outside and kind of cauterizes it, where you start to instantly get a nice crust, and you can see as I give it just a couple shakes, and it very easily moves. And that's what we want to do. We want to let it saute, but I like to give it a little shake every now and then just to make sure we're not getting no stickage. Because if it starts to stick, then it becomes just such a pain to flip it, and it really makes the whole cooking process hard. Have a hot pan, you don't have to stress about it too much. Now, while that's cooking, what we're looking to do is get some great color on each side. Depending on the thickness of the fish, this catfish itself isn't too thick. So this is one of these recipes I love cooking live because this whole dish will be done live. It's all going to be done in real time. By the time we're done with this demo, everything will be cooked other than chopping a few things. This all will come together very quickly in about 5 or 10 minutes. Now, to make this, I mentioned we're calling this dish Catfish Provencal. What that means is we're going to make this Provencal sauce. Now, what does it mean when we say Provencal? Well, we're referring to the Provence region of France. Now, the Provence region of France is different than, say, typical French cuisine that people classically think of. When people think of classic French cuisine, they're probably thinking of the food of Paris, which oftentimes has lots of dairy, and the Provence style is oftentimes lighter and more Mediterranean. So it will actually have more in common in its style to foods like Spanish and Italian cuisine than the classic French cuisine that we think of. So we're just using these classic Provence flavors of tomatoes, olive oil, and wine, which is very common of cooking in that area. If you're into cooking, you might have heard of herbes de Provence. Herbes de Provence is the herbs of that area, which is often basil and lavender and different spices like that. So we're just kind of honoring that area, but at the same time, we're going to we're in Louisiana, so we're going to give it a little Creole influence. And right off the bat, we're going to start with some andouille sausage. And we're just going to get some andouille sausage starting to crisp up in a skillet. Now, if you read the recipe, you'll say in the same pan. You can absolutely do that. When the fish is done, you can make this sauce real quickly. But for demo purposes and to kill two birds with one stone, I kind of separated everything out into two pans. But if you don't have access to andouille, any smoked sausage would be fantastic. And since I just mentioned earlier that this is of a very Mediterranean influence, a Spanish sausage like chorizo would be absolutely fantastic in this dish. But because we have that great andouille sausage, which is the smoked sausage of Louisiana, and we're in Louisiana, well, we're going to put some andouille in it. But any sausage would be good. If you don't have sausage, a little diced ham, a little diced bacon, that would all be fantastic too. And then as that starts to crisp, watch how quickly this starts to come together. We got the andouille cooking. I'm going to go in with a little bit of shallots and a little bit of minced garlic, and I'm just going to let that saute just for a second. Mix that around and just get that cooking and have everything kind of start to come together, and just looking to sweat those vegetables, meaning we just want to quickly, lightly cook them where they start to get a little translucent. I'm going to come back over to my catfish, and let's see how we're doing here. Give it a little flip, and look, let me pick this skillet up because this is exactly what we're looking for. Let me pick this skillet up. Look at that color that we're starting to get there. We've got a nice, good caramelization, and that's important. You really, although you don't want it to stick and you want to move it around every time just to make sure that fish isn't sticking, you're going to develop so much flavor by letting that flour start to caramelize on the fish. You're really looking to get that golden brown color. That's where you get so much flavor. Okay, we got our sausage going with our shallots and garlic, and now I'm going to put in some cut cherry tomatoes. Now, our recipe, which is going to be showing up online on Facebook, or also our recipes are always available on our website. If you read the actual recipe, the recipe says diced tomatoes. Well, here's a quick little trick that I like to do. Instead of dicing tomatoes, which of course you can do because it's right there in the recipe, sometimes what's very easy is just to get these cherry tomatoes, and instead of dicing tomatoes, I can very simply, I'll take a cherry tomato, just split it in half. And that's what I'm using today. Just a quick little substitution that A, makes life easier. It's so easy just to split that tomato into two. But also, I actually kind of like how when the sauce comes together, I like seeing kind of those rustic chunks of the big tomatoes in the pot. So that works out perfectly. Either one's fine, and you could go either way. You could dice the tomatoes or use the cherry tomatoes. As we just want to cook this very quickly, I still like, this isn't marinara sauce. I'm not looking to cook this and cook this down. This is meant to be quick, vibrant, and fresh. So just a quick saute, and that's all we're going to do. Next, we're going to deglaze the pan with some wine. The recipe calls for rosé. Rosé wine, which is, the wine made from red grapes, but the seeds have been removed, so some of that pink color still stays, and it's a great flavor that really matches with all of with this dish. However, if you don't have access to rosé, any white wine, very easy substitute you could use. Instead of using rosé, just put some white wine into it. No problem, don't have to worry about it. A little bit of that wine's going to go in. We have the diced tomatoes. I'm going to add just a little bit of tomato juice. You can get tomato juice from cans, or you can sometimes puree tomatoes to actually get some of the liquid from it. Either one's fine. We just put a little bit in it to give this a little bit of body. Look how simple this is. Olive oil, garlic, tomatoes, some sausage and some shallots, and now we're just going to let that cook. We're going to come back to our fish. Now, a couple things that we can talk about the fish. Depending on how thick your fish is, will ultimately decide how long you want to cook this. Thin pieces of fish are going to cook faster, but let's say you were doing this with halibut or a thick piece of salmon, which you could easily adapt this thing. What you might want to do is it might not finish cooking in the skillet, so what I like to do is have an oven turned on 350 degrees, and you could saute your fish on each side and get that great crust, and then you can just take that skillet, transfer it right to the oven. Important that it's not wooden or rubber, because that will burn in the oven, but I can put this skillet right into an oven and just let it go for about 5 or 10 minutes, and it'll finish cooking this fish. But if you're wondering, anytime you're cooking a white flaky fish, like trout, like catfish, how do you know when it's done? Well, I want to show you. If I take my finger and I just kind of press on the fish, and because the fish is flaky, if my finger easily kind of pushes into the fish and I can feel those layers kind of separating, and I get no resistance, no bounce back, then I know the fish is done. So this catfish here, I'm pushing it, and I feel I know if I apply just a little bit of pressure, my finger would go right through that fish. I know the fish is done, because fish gets very flaky whenever it's cooked. If it was still a little rubbery, if it's a little bouncy, that means the fish is probably still a little raw on the inside. It hasn't cooked all the way. Or you could always just take a knife, do a little cut in, peek inside, and that's an easy way as well. Back to our sauce. We let that tomato juice and that wine simmer a little bit. Right at the very end, we're going to add some chopped parsley, some sliced green onions, and then, of course, everything we're going to season with a little bit of salt, a little bit of cracked black pepper. And that is it. Like I said, in real time, this comes together very quickly. Just give this a little mix. And what I like about this is you can prepare this very quickly, and I love the freshness about it. I love the vibrance about it. It's not nothing, like I said, not a marinara. We're not cooking them tomatoes down. We still want those tomatoes to have some texture and some freshness about it. So how are we going to serve it? Well, I'm just doing everything real simply. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to take and put a nice scoop of rice on here, but vegetables, fantastic, roasted potatoes, pasta, a little buttered pasta noodles on the bottom would all be really killer with this dish. But also we can just keep it simple as well and just put a little bit of steamed rice. It's almost like a Creole. I need a spoon, that one right here. And then we can go ahead and plate this up. I'm going to take one of these pieces of catfish, put that on top, and then we're going to come back with a nice generous helping of this Provencal topping with all those great sausage and tomatoes and just wine. And this was just made so simply, but it has such great, fresh, vibrant flavor. I just love it. we like to finish a lot of dishes anytime. Herbs, green herbs go so well with tomatoes, so we like adding a little bit of green oil in the restaurant. And then I have a little bit of fresh basil here. And what I like to do, because this is so delicate, I'm just going to kind of rip some of these, you know, basil and tomatoes. That's classic. So we're just going to rip a little bit of this fresh basil. I'm not even chopping it. I'm just tearing some of this basil with my hands. And there it is, guys. This is our Catfish Provencal, cooked in the style, a Creole style, with our Provence, France influence. There it is. Thank y'all so much. So great to be back here cooking with you guys. We'll see you next week.